Well, first of all, thank you for honoring me to be here with you. This organization has a long and distinguished history of pursuing great policies statewide with great impact. I can remember many projects working with Governor Symington and then later with Governor Brewer, where your organization was loud and clear about what it meant and what it stood for and provided leadership to the community. So it's an honor for me to be here. Thank you very much. There's a lot of friends and faces. I'd start down a road right now of a big mistake because there's so many friends in the room that it's a pleasure. I don't often get down here, and it's a pleasure to see so many friends. Thank you, Julie, for the introduction. I got a ton of slides, and Ted's told me to beat a path through them, so we're going to do that. So this election was about Trump. I know that was probably a shock to all of you, but we actually can show that. This is, I should say at the start, my good friend Bill McInturf with Public Opinion Strategies did a sort of a national overview. I have a statewide overview here, and I called my good friend Bill, and I said, Bill, could I use some of your stuff? And he says, as long as you give me credit, I'm good with that. So a great firm. I met Bill working on Governor Symington's first campaign, or second campaign in 1994. He did all of Senator McCain's stuff, just great shop in Washington and great people, very, very smart guys and gals. And Bill, this is one of Bill's slides. So as you can see, was it about Trump? Well, supporting president, there was, in 2010, you saw that 63% of the electorate, it was about Obama. Well, we beat that this time with 68% being about Trump. This is exit polling information, and you'd see it was 37% of the electorate was dictated to by opposing the president. Typically, when a president's job approval rating is below 49, they lose an average of 39 seats. Well, guess what? They lost 39 seats. It might be up to 40 now. This might be old, but that's generally the case. It's interesting. It's the first time in history that 4 successive presidents have lost control of a Congress. Republicans lost 39 House seats while only losing the actual vote in swing seats by 1 point. So yes, it was a very close election. There was a lot of very, very close elections and close contests, as we saw here in the state of Arizona. Republican, total U.S. vote. This is the Cook political report in swing districts, and you can see the net difference between the generic ballot test was 50 Democrat, 49 Republicans, so it was only +1. So it's a very tight election cycle, and as we all see, many things happen in tight election cycles. Record spending in a midterm election. So, candidates raised, Republicans, total of 1.1 billion, almost 1.2 billion total spending by outside groups, but this is going to continue to happen. Since Citizens United happened and we have 501c4s, you'll see more and more spending. What you have to look at, people say to me, well, gosh, everything's so negative all the time. Well, negativity is what you have to understand about those types of groups, that outside spending groups. They're generally not there to tell you how great a job you're doing. And they do that to both sides, and both sides spend an inordinate amount of money trashing the other candidate. And so I try and help people understand it's really not the candidates spending that message, it's really these outside spending groups that are doing that. But until we get a handle on that, this is going to continue to happen. Here's an interesting side. There's all-time record 234 women running for Congress, 182 Democratic women, 52 Republicans. There'll be 90 new members in the House of Representatives. 35 of them are Democratic women, only 1 Republican woman. So yeah, it's about Trump. Women voted Democrat for Congress by a record margin and a record gap compared to men. 2018 margin, it's a +19 for women. You saw in 16, it was +10 on the Democratic side. 2014, a much tighter election, +4. That's the last midterm. So, there's a 23 net percentage points by gender in terms of support for Democrats. Republicans lost all white college voters by 8 points. This is continuing a trend that's been happening nationally for a while, and you can see that 53% voted Democrat, 45% voted Republican. That's a shift, a significant shift, but it keeps falling, as you can see, 58 and 10, 57, 54, 45. So that's a trend that you got to pay attention to. Democrats dominate urban and now suburban districts as well. GOP has lost 21 seats of 25, won by Hillary Clinton in 2016. So you can see that urban voters, always traditional Democratic base, that is now spread largely into suburban districts as well. One of the explanations why you saw some, and we'll go through some of the numbers here in Arizona in a minute, but it's one of the reasons why Democrats did well, because they did very well in Maricopa County for the first time in many of those suburban cities. Interesting thing, though, 2018 key races featuring Democratic progressives, they all lost. I mean, big progressive, if you embraced a progressive Democratic agenda in a traditional Republican-leaning state, you lost. The races Bill picked out here was Florida, Georgia, Arizona with our Governor Ducey, and Texas with Ted Cruz. So we'll talk a little bit about this as we go on, but there's a lesson there in terms of what purple means and what blue means. And blue does not mean purple, and purple does not mean red. And so how you narrate a campaign, as we saw firsthand here in Arizona, makes a lot of difference in terms of how the electorate reacts to you. Record midterm election participation. So we had 64% participation in 2018. You know, we went into this election cycle thinking there would be about 700,000 fewer voters than there were in the 2014 cycle, which was a record low. 2014 was record low, 47.5% in a gubernatorial cycle. And this time, we almost came to presidential levels. We were about 2 points below presidential levels of participation. I don't see that stopping. I think that's going to continue, and that will continue. We'll talk about how candidates need to pay attention to particular demographics when elections are like this, because it's no longer, you just can't message to the Republican base. You got to be able to figure out how independents and PNDs and Democrats and Republican women in particular are behaving. Again, general election turnout, this is history, just on the same chart, but you can see, of course, primary election turnout always low, always substantially lower, but we're going to expect to see increases in primary participation as well. There'll be an uptick. There was an uptick this time, and we saw that, and we anticipate an uptick next time. About the election, so back into who's participating. So before the polls even opened in 2014, in this cycle, 50,000 more independent or unaffiliated voters had already voted than in all of 2014. Before polls opened, 18 to 34-year-olds made up 13% of the electorate. That is unheard of when you talk about, because usually voters, older voters tend to dominate, and they were matching the performance of those voters 77 and older. And I know there's some people that are 77 in the room, but that's a big part of the Arizona electorate. Older voters make up, in a typical election cycle, 60, 55 and above is usually about 60 to 65% of the electorate. However, more than 600, this was the crazy thing, and we'll hear about this during the legislative session as well. More than 600,000 ballots were counted and processed after Election Day. So in Maricopa County alone, there was 195,000 ballots that were dropped off at the polls on Election Day. There's an argument there, a policy argument is, are those early voters or are those Election Day voters? I've made an argument that at the very least we should know at the end of an election cycle how many ballots are in the box. So you could easily do that by scanning them in. You're not counting them, but at least you can defeat some of the, dangerous rhetoric about people driving around with, trunks full of ballots or something like that, because you know how many, I think we have a right to know at least how many ballots are in the ballot box on election night. The challenge in terms of voting them, because one of the arguments is they're no longer early voters if you're voting on Election Day. The challenge is a software problem, because if you don't show up at your precinct and you try and turn it in at some other precinct, the scanner's not calibrated for your district. You could be turning in a ballot from, that's got your school board and all these other things on it that's not calibrated on that machine. So there's fundamental ways to resolve that and solve it, but that's going to be probably the subject of some discussion this time. But you can see there was over 628,000 ballots counted and processed after Election Day on 16. That's more than double what happened in 14. So clearly this is a turnout mechanism. I think the Democratic Party did a really good job of getting people to get their ballots to the polls. Independent and unaffiliated voters showed up in record numbers too. So about the blue wave, we all heard about, oh, it's going to be the big blue wave cycle. Well, really what happened in this election is Republicans underperformed a bit by about 3 points. Democrats overperformed by about 2 points, and independents, and PNDs, that's party not designated. That's a voter ID in the file. PND voters typically participated about twice the rate of independent voters. So you track them, you watch them, and you pay attention. They generally are socially conservative and or fiscally conservative and more socially moderate voters. That's what I am. So still a decrease of more than 251,000 voters, though, compared to the presidential cycle in 16. So again, you're probably going to have upwards of, more, in the next cycle in 20, you'll have a much bigger audience even then to deal with. People get upset with me when I say, yeah, Arizona's still red. Well, it is. It's still a red state because you got your governor, your attorney general, our state treasurer's in the room, and of course, the only state in the union that elects our mine inspector. Everybody loves Joe Hart, and is still red. Democrats made some gains, as we shall see, but let's look at how that happened. This is a poll that we commissioned about a week before the McSally-Sinema race, and these were our crosstabs. We saw McSally winning about 51% of the male vote, 42% for Sinema female. Sinema was winning 48% to 42. Sinema was picking up about 10% of Republican votes going in, whereas McSally was only picking up about 4% of Democratic votes. But here's the big, again, getting back to who shows up and who's participating. And your PNDs, she's beating her 2-1, 51 to 25, and amongst independents, it's 44-38. That PND number is very important because those people do show up. They show up every time and they come and participate. So an example of what exactly everybody was wondering, well, what happened here? Well, about 195,000 people supported Doug Ducey and also voted for Kyrsten Sinema. So that's just a plain math equation that you can deduce and say that's how Kyrsten Sinema won the race. She picked off those voters. She messaged to those voters. We saw she didn't have a primary. So we saw those ads early on that she was messaging to the middle. We had an ad with her brother in it with a Blue Lives Matter shirt on it. She was messaging to them all along. The McSally campaign, of course, had a more difficult primary, but even after the primary, there really wasn't a tonality change in their race. They didn't really change their narrative to talk to some of these voters that Sinema was picking up. Education's still going to be the top issue. Immigration, is still the top issue with Republicans. Education is the top issue with Democrats. As we get back into the rhythm of the next legislative session, it will continue to be the '1 issue. But it was an interesting cycle because we saw Governor Ducey pivot substantially this spring when he had 50,000 teachers in the street and went from a 1% pay raise to a 20% pay raise. And then, I was part of these discussions with the Save Our Schools movement and the School Board Association and some of those folks, and then the AEA encouraged all the Democrats to vote against the pay raise. That was clearly a pivotal moment in choosing how to narrate the general election for the education community. They said they're going to go get the initiative on the ballot on the income tax. We talked about how the polling data showed a sales tax, statewide sales tax would have passed like a layup, and they wanted to go do a progressive income tax initiative. We argued that that was a bad idea, that would probably be defeated, and you would lose the opportunity to get more money for teachers. We lost that debate. They went ahead and put that The AEA went ahead and put that on the ballot. And as we saw, the Supreme Court knocked it off because it wasn't written well. It was sold as an increase on the top wage earners in the state, but they neglected to write it so to address the indexing of all the other income brackets. And the court, rightfully in my mind, threw it off because they had misrepresented it even in their own language. They said, well, we didn't mean to do that. Well, draft better next time. Kathy Hoffman won the superintendent's race. You know, Frank Riggs ran a really good campaign for a Republican. He narrated a really good campaign. He talked about, you know, it wasn't a conservative mantra, but it was just, you know, this was one of those races where, you know, being a white older man running on the Republican ticket against a Democratic female, not a good combo, not a good cycle for, you know, white older men. We saw like many of them lose in the Democratic primary. In this cycle, a bunch of state representatives lost. Ken Clark in my neck of the woods up in Phoenix got beat by a more progressive in their own primary. So very interesting cycle to be in, very tough one on people like Frank. Females and unaffiliated voters made a huge difference in the final days. The two biggest races that had a big impact on, both on election night when we closed and we still had those 600,000 ballots out there, both Secretary of State and Sandra Kennedy, the corporation commissioner, were behind by fairly substantial margins. The AP even called the race for Gaynor. I said, that's a mistake because you don't know how many votes are out there. And I suspected when we got off the air on Tuesday night, I was on KJAZ, and I said, Sinema's going to win this race because you could just see where the early ballots were, where they'd come in. And what she had done on early ballots previously, when the early ballots that had been counted at 8 o'clock, she was ahead. So was Hobbs, so was Kennedy. The election day turnout changed that, and then you still had these 600,000 ballots out, which had a Democratic edge in it and was large enough to carry both Ms. Hobbs and Ms. Kennedy to a win. It's the first time, many of you know, we've had a Secretary of State from the Democratic Party since the mid-90s when Richard Mahoney was there. I would say that's an insurance policy that Doug Ducey will be staying as our governor for the next 4 years, God willing. So changes to the legislature. This is a big deal. This is a really big deal. There was really no upsets in the state Senate in terms of changing the balance. Kate Brophy-McGee won her race in District 28 in suburban Phoenix. They lost a House seat there, but she won that by about 200 votes. They put everything they had into taking her out. She survived, and Republicans held on to a 17-13 advantage in the Senate. Speaker Rusty Bowers is now the Speaker of a body that is 31 Republicans and 29 Democrats. You need 31 votes to pass a bill in the state legislature. So as I joked with Rusty on election night or thereafter, I said, you know, the old school, when it was close, you know, the Navajo Nation becomes a much more important place because you can start shopping for votes on the Navajo Nation, and that's a historically thing. You'll see that happen in this time. But you'll also see some of these Democrats who got elected. Lieberman in District 28 is already trying to meet with every Republican he can. He's trying to figure out a way that they can be meaningful, and they may be meaningful right out of the box when we first charge of the legislature of the fall will be adopting the DCP plan that Ted was in a meeting yesterday. There's a framework for that coming together, but there's some interest that particularly on the cattleman side and the rancher side, development community side, that's pushing for additional water for Pinal County, which is going to be hard to get. And I would suggest that, you know, they will have a difficult time, and that will give an opportunity for the Democratic caucus to be a very meaningful participant in adopting DCP. But 31-29, I think it's the closest since the late 50s in our legislature. So keep your prayers. Drought contingency plan. That's the plan that Central Arizona Water, CAP is working on with the governor, the Bureau of Reclamation, and our state's Native American tribes, and a giant community trying to make sure Tucson has water. The state's former senator knows that all too well. He was a big part of delivering that down here. So those are the, you know, lessons from 18. Changes in turnout do not guarantee different results. It's candidates do matter, how they message. We all saw that in this race out here and how they message their campaigns. Message matters, money matters. Got to have money. Usually message and money are related. 2020, you know, we could have a record turnout. I would suspect, this is a guess, it's a shot in the dark, but we could be approaching 80% of the registered electorate showing up on election day in the general election, and I would suspect that we'll have another record turnout in the primary. And the electorate is energized, and who knows, but the good Lord himself, what happens with Robert Mueller and our president and all the other things that are happening back there that could create even a more interesting cycle. Those are my observations. Looking forward to 2020, I said we could have the highest voter turnout was in 1980. Presidential averages, it's usually about Republicans 40, Democrats 32, independents and others at 28. That 28 is really important in how they vote and how they participate. Big thing most people are not thinking about is signature requirements to get anything on the ballot. That is through the roof now. For a statutory requirement, you need 237,000 valid signatures, which means you probably got to collect about 370,000 valid signatures. And on a constitutional measure, Terry Goddard tried to do the dark money constitutional ban. He got enough signatures, or so he thought, until the lawyers got in the room. And then, is now up to 356, which means you probably need closer to 450 to 500,000 signatures to get a constitutional amendment on the ballot. So very, very difficult, very, very expensive to do. On the ballot in the next cycle, as we know, the President of the United States and the poor schmucks who want to run for the U.S. Senate seat, because as we know, that seat will be on the ballot in 20. It will be on the ballot again in 22, and it will be on the ballot again in 24, because that is the end of Senator McCain's cycle. So that will get back into rhythm by having that poor person run 3 times in 3 successive years on statewide campaigns. Referendums, I think we should expect to see something from the marijuana industry. There's a discussion going on right now whether to materialize or mature the medical marijuana or go, as many states have gone, to a more legalized atmosphere. That's looking at it. All the gaming compacts expire. All the Native American gaming compacts expire in 24. We adopted those by initiative in 2004. They were 20-year compacts. They are up. And so the Native American communities are very interested in renewing those compacts because they really can't build anything on their reservation without having a demonstrable revenue stream that's blessed. And so you should expect to hear, I think the governor's thinking long and hard about that in terms of an opportunity for revenue for education. You have a public safety personnel retirement system that's badly underfunded as well. That could be part of that conversation. And then, dark money, election reform issues will probably be back on the ballot in some way, shape, or form in the 20 cycle as well. Candidates matter, as I said. You remember when Governor Ducey was losing to an unnamed candidate this summer? Well, the same can be said for Trump. Trump's going to have a struggle against an unnamed candidate, but as the Democrats convene their election process and their primary begins this spring, you could expect that to be a very nice contrasting message opportunity for a Trump White House. So how they manage that process and whether or not it just becomes a Trump hate fest and doesn't message what they're for will obviously either benefit or hurt the incumbent office holder in the White House. Can Democrats say what they're for? We saw Kirsten's campaign this time. There's a demonstrable path on how Democrats can win in Arizona. Talking about Arizona, talking about being an Arizonan, talking about what it means to be an Arizonan, talking about independence. But as we all know, it comes down to you have to vote on things. I thought the McSally campaign missed an opportunity on the Kavanaugh nomination not to make that a bigger part of the discussion in this cycle. But can Democrats, what are Democrats going to be for? How do they begin to articulate that? We saw the health care message this time. That obviously resonates. The American Affordable Health Care Act is now part of the American process now, and it's how do we improve from there? How do we work on affordability? How do we work on our nation's deficit? That will become an issue in this cycle. It's $1 trillion. Don't quite know how that works. Effect of bruising primaries. Again, Sinema didn't have one. David Garcia did. Katie Hobbs didn't have one. And so those are the things that you should look for as we look forward to 20. Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity. I'm happy.